Folks, this right here is Japan in 1922, and as it is very typical for disaster saves, everything looks really great at first glance. We have a beautiful countryside, we have a couple of really nice megacities, and a literal ray of God is shining down on us. I think it is safe to assume that somewhere right now Tom Cruise is running around believing to be the last samurai. And yet, when I hover over the radical number, we will realize that literally everybody hates us in every place in this country. Something went horribly wrong in this playthrough, and we're going to explore what it was, how to fix it, and how to recognize it when it happens to you. Now, as it is common with these videos, we initially of course need to take a look at this whale right here, and then at the very stats that make our country up. Because this Japan is in a dire situation, but it's definitely recoverable, and we need to understand what exactly led us here. First of all, when it comes to the capacities, we can immediately notice that our bureaucracy is of course in the negatives. Now, 7.4% tax waste is nothing to sneeze at, but it's also nothing to write home about. We want to get rid of this, but it's definitely not what is actually actively bankrupting our country. What we will probably just be doing is simply size down some of these institutions right here. Taking a look at our monetary section, I think it's important to immediately realize that only a few numbers are actually important so that we can understand what is going on in the country. Let's start with the balance right here that is of course deeply negative. We're losing over 100,000 every single week. But I have to tell you, when you look at this number, you also always have to take into account your credit and your credit limit. Right now, we're not even 1/3 towards the credit limit, and we're only gaining 100k every single week. Now, sure, ultimately, eventually, we might max out our credit, but we're so far away, and I do think that this is a very fixable balance number that we shouldn't be concerned about this right now whatsoever. This situation looks worse than it actually is. This right here, our investment pool on the other hand, is something that we need to address as soon as possible. If we are in a position where we're not taking in enough money and where we are spending a lot of money, we have to of course generate more money. And more money is generated by enriching people, by building more GDP, and by then using that wealth for your state. And this wealth right here, 11.4 million, are just sitting in the investment pool. The underlying issue, and I think this is very apparent right here as well, simply comes from the fact that we are too slow at investing. The issue of investing too slowly actually runs pretty deep in the save game, which is something we'll see as we investigate the population later on. But for the moment, we just need to earmark this. This money needs to be spent. The very last important number that we need to understand when it comes to our financials can be found in the expenses. There's a number here that is also very easily misinterpreted. So just make sure that you don't fall into that trap. I'm of course talking about the legendary, the beautiful welfare payments. Welfare payments that go to pops that either aren't earning enough in their job or that are in a position where they aren't working at all. We're currently paying over 500,000 every single week, which of course very heavily weighs down our state budget. This is one of those things that can be misinterpreted because regularly, as you are in such a situation, you might see yourself in that spot when, for example, your population is incredibly rich and the welfare payments and minimum wage are incredibly high. This makes it so that pops simply aren't willing to really take up a different job in a different factory because the welfare payments are already enough. What we're looking at here is a situation where that is not the case though. This is not a case like we had it in Belgium where the entire economy crashed and everything had completely been destroyed. As you can see, these are still working beautifully, and yet we have this many people that are on welfare payments. And this is also not a situation where the people on welfare payments are living a good life. Look at them right here. They are struggling. 2.18 million of this pop, which is 100%, are underneath the expected standard of living. And that is, of course, absolutely horrendous. It makes them into radicals, it makes them unhappy, and it leaves us with a huge hole in the budget. Because if these people are poor, they also can't really buy anything. This then is further confirmed if we take a look at our GDP. Our GDP as a whole, I have to tell you, looks pretty decent. We're number 7. For a tutorial playthrough, that isn't too bad at all. But once we really take a look at the GDP per capita at 2.88, you can see that it is disastrous. A GDP per capita of 2.88 is quasi-pre-industrialization. And if you pair this up with people having very high life expectations, with our market needing to actually sustain our state budget and our literacy rate making the life expectations of our people even higher, you end up with this right here. The interesting situation here is that we effectively have overpopulation. Now normally at this point in the video we still go about the budget, the politics, but none of that actually really matters here because this really is an issue of overpopulation that we need to address, and for that we do need to understand population a bit better. See, when I took over this save game and took a look at it and realized it was overpopulation, I was actually incredibly excited. Sure, it largely stems from the fact that we're constructing too slowly, but this is a really good chance to talk about how pops work, what actually is going on here, and why we are in double trouble rather than just overpopulation. It also gives me the chance to talk about how to regulate your construction capacity and how to realize that you can build more and that you might be a bit too cautious. Alright, now it's time that we properly understand pop growth and the workforce ratio, and for this I have chosen this save game right here. This is a multiplayer game where I played an incredibly regressive Russia. All of our laws are basically still the standard, if not worse, serfdom still exists, and so on, despite it being 1878. With this save game, we're going to take a look at one of the pops that lives in Moscow, and we're going to track him after I change all of the laws. Now, when I say change all of the laws, I do indeed mean the console, because I want a drastically different environment for that pop so that we can really observe the changes. This means that we will become much more socialist-esque, and that we're looking at a couple of laws that make it so that our workforce ratio changes drastically, our mortality/birth rate of course also changes in our favor, and that the literacy rate goes up. All of these things are important because then we're looking ultimately at a situation that is fairly comparable to everything going on in our Japan game. So, the premise here is that the pops will be forced to change significantly because the situation in society has changed after we change the laws. Nonetheless, we obviously need somebody to actually keep track of, otherwise we won't know how these laws change the situation. We do this by just selecting a pop right here in Moscow. In fact, this labor pop looks beautiful. They work in the logging camp, and they are the only labor pop working in the logging camp, meaning that we can just keep track of this building and everything will be alright. This pop here currently has a population of 370,000. Every year it is projected to grow by around 6,000. Its workforce is 92,000 and the dependents are 278,000. All of these are the current status quo numbers. Currently, we are at 24.8% of a workforce ratio. You can see this right here as well. Roughly 1/4 of the entire pop is actually part of the workforce. This is because the base value for laborers is 25%, and none of my current very regressive laws pushes more of the non-workforce into the workforce. Let's take a look of how it progresses in a few years. Alright, and here we are about 5 years later. It's 1883. The AI has built a truly insane amount of construction capacity. No idea why they would need 2,115 with just about 315 in GDP, but hey, more power to them, I guess. This right here is our beloved pop, and things have changed. You can see that they have a slightly higher standard of living, but probably more importantly, their population number has changed drastically. We're now looking at a pop strong of 306,000 people, 92,000 workforce, nothing changed there, but only 214,000 dependents. Now, if you haven't taken a look at how pops grow and what that actually looks like in the system, then you might say, wait a minute, but this pop actually shrunk. But don't worry, that is working as designed. It makes perfect sense as well if you think about it. If you consider pop growth to basically be them shedding some pops. What I mean here is that if we are underneath the desired workforce ratio, in this case we have now reached 30% out of 50% desired, every time we grow, every time we reconsider the size of this pop, the game will say, wait a minute, you can shed a couple of your dependents. Obviously, sometimes new pops are also simply created because that is our annual net growth, but fundamentally what is happening right here is the workforce ratio is slowly but surely, after 5 years already growing by 5%, approaching the 50% target, making it so that this pop, despite actually growing, effectively shrinks, because obviously it sheds all of the dependents that are no longer a part of this pop into a different pop. This different pop will then, every now and again, pop up right here in this list. I think we should see it in just a couple of ticks here, as an unemployed new laborer pop. There, for example, is one charge of 200 people. If I unpause, I believe we should see even more. In this case, they actually already got hired. Yeah, there's a lot here. There you go, 4.26k. This one has a workforce ratio of about 30.6%, so fairly close to the pop that we're watching. But this is how it fundamentally works. Now, what happens with these pops? When they grow, they're spit out as the same pop type but unemployed, and then seek employment either somewhere else, so for example in a different building in the same state, or they do it on the subsistence farms. If they can't find anything in either of these places, then they will remain unemployed and potentially start migrating away. But in this case, and you can see it right here, we have empty subsistence farms. Now if we jump forward about another 5 years and another, my god, 4,000 construction capacity, we're looking now at a pop that is even smaller. You can see that the workforce ratio has adjusted itself to 34.2%, and that this means that there are fewer dependents. The workforce, of course, remained the same, and everybody that rolls out of this pop, everybody that gets shed, ends up on the subsistence farms. This, yet again, we can confirm by just looking here and checking out the actual employment statistics. We are hiring like crazy. Now, this is this pop. Ultimately, the consequence of everything that we've done is that they are creating more and more people as they shed their dependence. This is important to understand and important to point out, because if you think about it, you will realize that this is happening all over the country. Every single pop that used to be very, very low on the list when it comes to its workforce ratio, all of a sudden decided, you know what, I need to start working on that. These laborers here, for example, have already reached 37.5% rather than just the 34% that we have on the other pop. Either way, what we're looking at here is a situation where our population obviously grows, but maybe more importantly, more people of that population actually expect to be employed. This leads, even here in Russia, with a lot of subsistence farmland, to more unemployed people and to many more peasants. I believe in 1878 we had about 7 million peasants, and now about 4 million have returned to the fields. Alright, now all we need to do is apply this to Japan to understand why the player here made a fatal mistake by going for a high workforce ratio. It is evident that, of course, as a population grows, if you fail to build enough opportunities for them, you will get more unemployment. We actually, though, made unemployment significantly worse, because we pushed people out of being dependents and pushed them into being their own workforce, except without any jobs. As you can see, they are unemployed with a workforce ratio of 41.2%. If this ratio was just, let's say, the native 25%, we might actually be looking at a situation where many fewer people would be unemployed, would then be collecting unemployment benefits, seeing how these welfare payments are only paid to the workforce part of a pop, and with that our state budget would be pretty okay, or at the very least that is the logic behind it. This means that since we are overpopulated, since we do have such a great pop growth, we exacerbated the issue massively. As far as pop growth and indeed the workforce ratio are concerned, we don't really need to do much more other than understanding that this is part of why our issue here in Japan is so extreme. We have currently a massive increase in population, and this has been the case for quite some time. This is true because whenever you do get a good institution as Japan, such as for example an almost maxed out health system, it applies to a massive region. Most countries in Victoria 3 actually have very few incorporated states and a very small incorporated population. Japan has a genuinely massive one. It is quite comparable to France, except France of course already starts with a massive population and good institutions at the start of the game, whereas you need to fight for them as Japan. But as soon as you do get those institutions, oh yeah, you are going to take off. Since we have women's suffrage and since we have trade union solidarity, we have an expected ratio of 50%. And currently are sitting with this pop at 41.2%. This means that this pop grows and will get more and more people in the workforce, fewer people in the dependents, new pops are shed that then will also have more people in the workforce compared to the dependents, making it so that they all get more unemployed benefits, because welfare payments are only paid to the actual workforce section of a pop, which we are actively increasing with the workforce ratio goal. The result here is that it's not always beneficial to go for higher workforce laws, even if it makes sense in the mindset that you have for your country. Equality and women in the workplace and of course voting sound good, but they can wreck your economy in the long term when your entire country is changing its workforce ratio. This is a big thing that we can address by, well, stopping this law and instead passing a different law. Yeah, you know, hey, this is a good law, but let's roll it back to propertied women at least for the moment, making it so that, indeed, we would be looking at a lower expected workforce ratio, hopefully stopping us from more and more people shedding into the unemployed population. Ultimately, though, it has to be said, even if we were to bring the workforce ratio down to a massive degree, we are still currently looking at much in welfare payments and of course many very unhappy pops that will create turmoil, which then in turn make it so that, yep, indeed, we collect fewer and fewer taxes everywhere. We need to address this crisis. And this crisis is completely unrelated to a population, it is a crisis of construction capacity. The construction capacity, since it doesn't go into the negatives or the positives, is a very difficult capacity to read, because it makes it so that you either know what this value means in comparison to other values, or you are sort of walking through the dark. This is something that can't really be avoided, I'm afraid to tell you. However, there are two elements that you need to inspect and afterwards will exactly know whether you should be expanding or shrinking your capacity, regardless of where that level of it is. First of all, these numbers are the budget and of course everything related to the actual input goods. Let's start with the input goods. Construction sectors, much like every other building in the game, require input goods to produce whatever they're producing, in this case construction. The efficiency at which we are producing construction with is of course determined by the actual production methods. Currently, we are employing iron frame buildings, which requires tools, fabric, wood and iron, and produces 25 construction. Steel frame buildings would require glass, explosives, tools and steel, and produce much more construction in comparison. Here's everything that you need to know when it comes to regulating your construction sector and your input goods. Whenever you expand your construction sector, it can't hurt to also simply produce a little bit more of whatever they are consuming. Now, the financial side of things is a bit less easy to understand, and I would personally argue also quite counterintuitive, because you need to understand why actually being in the negative is nothing to worry about. We're going to understand this here today, and for that we need to initially understand where the money comes from. There are only two sources that can pay for your construction. Either your immediate taxes, this is of course what goes into your construction sector if there is no investment pool, or if the investment pool is too small, and then on the other hand, logically, the investment pool. When the investment pool is very full, what this means is that you are literally not building enough. This is just a fundamental truth. But let's say the investment pool is empty. You have used up all of it and, well, it's completely gone. You will start tapping into your taxes. What do you do if that pushes you into the negatives? Is that good? Is that bad? How does it work? To really make sense of this, we need to make sense of how credit works in the game. On a core level, it looks very negative to amass more credit and to say, okay, this is going further and further to the right. But realistically speaking, credit is actually your friend. Credit in Victoria 3 isn't something that comes from nowhere and goes to nowhere. It is derived out of the value of your entire economy. If we hover over this, we can see right here that is derived out of the base of your GDP value. So our GDP currently generates 8.14 million credit, and then everything related here to the cash reserves of our building in our nation. As long as they are full, as long as they are doing well, we will have a massive credit situation. It's not just that, but it's also the case that our interest is then directly paid to the owning class. You can see it right here. We are currently paying 373 in interest to this pop. Now, that is literally nothing, but it is interesting because it means that our interest payments aren't just lost. They actively subsidize our population. Now, we can argue day in and day out over the interest rate. For example, being an unrecognized major power makes it so that we have plus 50%, whereas being a great power would make it so that we would get minus 50% loan interest rate. But ultimately, I will be honest with you, interest rate payments are unlikely to kill you. If anything, it is of course bankruptcy, right? But we have to understand that bankruptcy is something that you don't really need to fear if you just expand enough. What I mean here is that our credit limit, as already mentioned, is derived from our GDP and the gold reserves in our buildings. The more buildings we build, the more GDP we get, and the more buildings we build, obviously also the more gold reserves do these buildings have. This means that if we build more and more buildings and we go more and more negative, amassing more and more credit, we can still remain at the same credit limit ratio. Remaining at the same credit limit ratio is so important because as you improve your economy and build it up with the credit that you're of course taking on, you're also improving the money that you get from minting. And this money will regularly outpace everything related to interest. Again, right now we have terrible modifiers for our interest rate, and yet, I mean, just look at it right here. Our minting is very clearly outpacing it. This is important to understand. When you are not in the negatives, when your investment pool is accruing money rather than actually losing it, you are wasting potential that you could be having if you were instead to take up some credit. The interest rate won't kill you, and the overall credit isn't all too bad if your credit limit consistently outpaces it. This is essentially all you need to know. You want to be in the negatives, don't be afraid of it, and simply build it up. Because your credit limit, your ratio so to speak, will always remain the same if you build up fast enough without the goods being far too expensive. So what this means for our Japan game here is that we're going to draw some consequences here, and the most important one I think is we're going to abandon all of these very silly ports right here, and after that of course focus on building up our construction sectors. I'm gonna let these get finished just because they already exist. We're going to go ahead and build up more and more in our construction industry right here, because we want of course to have these as soon as possibly built up. Right, there you go, beautiful. And then we're going to go ahead and build more of the infrastructure that we need to actually maintain, well, these construction sectors without driving up prices through the roof. This means I will go ahead and just pop down a whole bunch of the steel mills, maybe some tool workshops as well. We need some glass works quite clearly as well. And I don't think we need to be worried about the question of do we have enough employees, because yeah, let's be real here, we have basically infinite of them. So let's roll back our workforce ratio and let's start building up this construction sector for good. And here we are, roughly 6 years later. I just took the liberty of just playing a bit, right? And check this out. Yeah, our GDP is now taking off as we have, of course, changed our construction capacity right here. We're also looking at a situation where our, well, credit looks much, much better. And as you can see, the interest means nothing in comparison to the minting progress that we have made because our GDP has grown like this. This is basically always worth it. It has also allowed me to actually just dial down everything related to our taxes, at least a little bit, making it so that we're getting even more money in the investment pool. And since the investment pool now is highly, highly positive, I think it is also time that I simply build even more construction capacity rather than just the 10 times that we had when we started the video. It's not just that though, it is also the fact that we did change the workforce ratio, and while people are still growing very, very aggressively in terms of, you know, the actual healthcare and so on, we are now looking at a population right here that is sinking in its workforce ratio, making it so that we pay them less money, and there are fewer unemployed people overall. We're down to 39.6%, and we are approaching 30%. I don't think we want to go down all the way to 30%, but of course for the moment it is alleviating our pressure when it comes to the unemployment benefits that we need to pay. Only 400k right now, we can handle it as well. Let's just carry on. It's 1930, you can see that we have even more construction capacity right now. I'm building it up steadily and keeping the prices fairly far down there where they belong, of course. And we are in a position now where we can actually build our own purchasing power. Now, before that, we were incredibly poor, which means that we produced something and nobody had the money to buy it. But now, slowly but surely, we're getting out of there. You can see that fewer people are now underneath the minimum expected standard of living, which is absolutely excellent because that means they can afford to buy whatever goods they want, and with that we will actually make more money. We are also using our investment pool efficiently. As you can see, it is empty and we're using all of its money, and our credit limit is looking absolutely beautiful. Our taxation level is also down because this means that people have more money to spend, and that is of course very important. I will also now put up these so that they have more spending money to begin with, even if it puts me further into debt. As you can see right here, we have a credit of 6.47 million in principle, but our maximum credit has risen to 51.4 million. I can't read anymore, that's okay. We're looking at a situation where interest payments are, yep, not all that much, but our minting is really taking off. This is why you want to build into your credit, because your minting will absolutely outpace the interest rate payments. Not just that, but it is also this beautiful exponential GDP curve right here. That is the way you want this to look. And so, as we are lifting people out of poverty, as these people are then with their workforce ratio actually going into a situation where, you know, they aren't collecting as much money as they were previously. You see it right here, they're up to down to 37.8%. We are having an easier time as an economy. Just take note, not every single society in your playthrough is made for a higher workforce ratio. You need to be aware what that law does, and you need to use it correctly. And as you can see, here we are with the end game screen. I just built more. You can see the beautiful, beautiful curve right there, as well as the standard of living, of course, going up. The prestige going up like crazy, and our population rising steadily. In the end here, I had to conquer a couple of colonies in Indonesia just to keep up with our demand. This game is exactly over right here, and I think the lesson should be build into your credit, keep building up, make sure that your workforce ratios are right, and you will absolutely prosper. We could have been even faster. You can see at a certain point I just didn't build out the construction sector anymore because we were doing well enough, but the reality is that yeah, well, we are doing well enough, right? I do realize, of course, that this video was a fairly dry, a fairly theoretical one, but I think it is very important to understand the basics of how pops grow, how they shed one another, and then, of course, how the workforce ratio changes. This is important because most of the time when I see people pass more of the progressive laws, they do it just because they are progressive rather than because they need them. It also is, of course, important to know everything about the credit limit and how it interacts with you building something. As you can see, at some point, I basically just stopped building up the construction sector, but no matter how you look at this, I hope that you now have a better understanding of regulating your input goods as well as your budget and your investment pool. Thanks so much for watching. This was this video, and I'll see you in 1.1. Later, alligator.